Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm very excited to see so many of you. To those of you who don't know me, my name is Pelle Valentin Olsen, and I'm Associate Professor of Modern Middle East History here at the University of Bergen. Over the past year and a half, perhaps more clearly than ever before, we have witnessed an assault on universities and pro-Palestinian activists, especially in the US, but in the name of combating anti-Semitism. However, even as Israel's genocidal war in Gaza continues, to many, Palestine is still an inconvenience. Palestine produces awkward silences. But Palestine is in many ways the canary in the coal mine. As one of my colleagues put it, Palestine is a mirror and a reminder. It is a cause that mocks ideological hypocrisies. It demands testimony and commitment. Palestine demands to know from all of us, where are you? Where were you? While many are rising up against the unprecedented attacks on universities, few have acknowledged the fact that these attacks began with Palestine. In many of these attacks, IHRA's definition of anti-Semitism, which we are here to talk about today, has played a key role. It has been weaponized with disastrous consequences, first for academics in Middle Eastern studies, but increasingly for the university as a whole. And I'm very happy to welcome and introduce Professor Bangstad, who is someone who has written about matters related to academic freedom and the question of Palestine, I think, with extreme clarity. Professor Bangstad is a social anthropologist and a research professor at the Institute for Church, Religion and Worldview Research in Oslo. He specializes in the anthropology of Islam, but he has also published extensively on racism, hate speech and Islamophobia. He was a distinguished professor, visiting professor at Princeton University for the teaching of anthropology from 2022 to 23, and has published more than 10 monographs and edited volumes. The title of his lecture or talk today is Academic Freedom and IHRA's Definition of Anti-Semitism. And we will have time for questions after the lecture. But please join me in welcoming Professor Bangstad.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. I'm very happy to be back in what is, after all, my hometown on such a beautiful day. And I'm also pleased to see so many in the audience and also, I believe, on Zoom. A few introductory remarks about my interest in this particular topic. Pelle mentioned that I was a visiting professor at Princeton University back in 2022-2023. Now, even before my arrival at Princeton, my course description and syllabus was picked up by a right-wing pro-Republican group by the name of Campus Reform. And so even before my course had started, I was the object of some unwelcome attention on the website of Campus Reform, which then spread all the way to Fox News. I'm not going to make it out as if this was a fundamental threat to my academic freedom or freedom of speech, but and as a matter of fact, colleagues at the department told me that for a number of years they'd had similar experiences, right? Whereby courses in which there was any reference to racism was deliberately targeted, right? By so-called student reporters who were actually pro-Republican conservative students in the student body at Princeton. Now, the reason I start with this is because, as you may be aware of, Princeton is now the subject of one of these anti-Semitism investigations conducted by an outfit called the National Task Force for Combating Anti-Semitism in the White House. And the reason why Princeton has been included on that list is as follows. An editor of Campus Reform who has never studied, and to the extent that we know it, has never even attended any events at Princeton, has filed a complaint against Princeton alleging Title VI discrimination under the Civil Rights Act 1964 on the basis of a class walkout which took place at Princeton's campus on October 24, 2023. And the worst example of the alleged anti-Semitism is the following, right? And now I'm, according to the Department of Education in the US, engaging in qualifiably anti-Semitic speech. There were chants from student protesters of the following: brick by brick, wall by wall, apartheid will fall. And the second item was the shout of Intifada. And this raises, of course, the question, how on earth can one qualify these statements as qualifiably anti-Semitic, right? Where does this even come from, right? But Princeton is now faced with cuts in federal funding to the tune of $210 million US. Princeton is fortunate in that it does not have the same dependence on federal funding as many other universities. Harvard is actually worst off because it has a large medical school like Columbia, and universities with medical schools are in the worst problems. I should also count here Johns Hopkins among those. I need to make some caveats initially as well. What I'm going to argue here today is not to deny that anti-Semitism exists, is a real problem and should be combated, right? It's important to say this because it's a known fact, also in Norway, that anti-Semitism is on the rise, right? However we measure it, it's on the rise, right? So according to the Holocaust Center's survey figures, there's been a rise in measured levels of anti-Semitism from 9% in 2022 to 11% in 2024. And we might not think much of a 2% rise in anti-Semitism, but what this doesn't tell us is, of course, what, say, Jewish pupils in Norwegian schoolyards experience, right? Which can be horrific enough. But let me start with the following quotations. And I also want to make this point, right? It's not as if one couldn't see this coming, right? If there's anything we ought to know about the far and racist right, it's that when they say they're going to do something, they do it, right? These are not empty words and phrases. So Donald Trump, in a speech to the Israeli-American Council in 2024, in September, says, "My promise to Jewish Americans is this: with your vote, I will be your defender, your protector, and I will be the best friend Jewish Americans have ever had in the White House." Now, Trump is at his transactional best, right? Because he says, in return of your vote. Now, Jewish Americans, by and large, do not and did not vote for Donald Trump, right? So much so that a recent survey tells us that 71% of Jewish Americans are dissatisfied with Trump's public performance after 100 days in office. And then there's Leo Terrell, currently the chair of the Trump administration's National Task Force on Anti-Semitism. On X, October 2024, Harvard will lose much more funding effective January 2025 because America will no longer tolerate Jew-hating schools, right? So here we have it. Harvard is a Jew-hating school. It so happens that Harvard has a Jewish president in Alan Garber, right? So I have a few problems with the assumption here. But anyway. Rashid Khalidi at Columbia University, in a really acerbic op-ed, which I didn't even dare post on social media because it was so acerbic, says the following: "It was never about eliminating anti-Semitism, it was always about silencing Palestine." And lastly, and this is an important reminder from scholars of anti-Semitism, very distinguished one, Professor Stephen Beller, a word like anti-Semitism should not be bandied about carelessly and without careful consideration, something which seems to have been completely forgotten by some of these actors. So I need to run through the current assault rather superficially. I'm working on the assumption here that most of you will know this, right? So I need to get to sort of the crux of my presentation. But as I said, it's no news that Republicans, by and large, consider universities and university professors in particular as the enemy, right? They've said so. J.D. Vance, the vice president, with a degree from Yale, of course, said as much in a much-quoted speech at the National Conservative Convention in 2021 already. Then there's the fact that you have any number of sort of detailed plans about what the second Trump administration would do. Many of them developed by the Heritage Foundation. Some of you will be familiar with the so-called Project 2025, but there's also the Esther Project, which was published in October last year. And this is basically a far-right conspiracy theory in which the main contention is that the US has been infiltrated by extremely well-financed and well-coordinated Hamas support network, and so this alleged Hamas support network has infiltrated government, civil society, Congress. Of course, Bernie Sanders is part of this shadowy network, among others, and also universities, right? So a couple of days ago, we get the most absurd op-ed in the Wall Street Journal by a Jewish former Harvard professor alleging that Harvard is an Islamist den, right? Where anti-Semitism has run rampant. Then there's the Trump administration's task force on combating anti-Semitism. Now, none of these members of the task force have any background in anti-Semitism studies, right? So there's Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, who's now busy instructing the arrest of the arrest of judges opposing deportation orders. There's Robert Kennedy Jr., more known as an anti-vaxxer than a Minister of Health so far, I think. And there's Josh Greenbaum, who has a background as an investment banker. And there's Leo Terrell, who has a PhD to his name from UCLA in law, but is most known for Fox News appearances. And also Linda McMahon, by the way, who is the Minister of Education, responsible for abolishing the Ministry of Education. She's got a BA, and among her most important credentials to Donald Trump is the fact that she was the chairperson of the World Wrestling Association. So there's a moral panic over anti-Semitism, but this moral panic is also a function of what definitions of anti-Semitism are used to classify anti-Semitic incidents. And here is a real problem, right? So according to the Holocaust Center data, 51% of Norwegians now subscribe to the view that what Israel is doing in Gaza can be compared to what Nazis did during World War II. According to the definition at work here, the IHRA 2016 working definition of anti-Semitism, this means that 51% of the Norwegian population is anti-Semitic. No, I don't believe that, and you probably don't either, right? The level we're talking about from serious surveys is 11%. In the US, the Anti-Defamation League, a pro-Israeli group, has made much of an increase in such incidents of a whopping 140% between 2022 and 2023. Now, they use the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism from 2016. If the alternative Jerusalem Declaration was used instead, the number of incidents would be cut in half. This was actually tested by some academics affiliated with the liberal Jewish Current, which is readily available online. So what's the background to the use of this particular definition? This was enshrined in Executive Order 138 99 of December 11, 2019. In other words, towards the end of Trump's first presidency, by means of which federal agencies in the USA adopted the IHRA working definition with the 11 accompanying examples of contemporary anti-Semitism. This executive order also means that persons of Jewish background can file complaints for discrimination under Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act if they are offended by any speak critical of Israel that have taken place at universities or other institutions. The working definition provides the legal threshold. So a lot of the federal anti-Semitism investigations at what is now 60 US universities have resulted from pro-Israeli and or pro-Republican activist groups filing and seriously, copy-paste against anything they could find, filing complaints under Title VI for alleged anti-Semitic incidents at universities with which they have never had a connection. And here's also part of what is troubling. The 2019 executive order, as well as a resolution of the US Congress in 2023, also means that anti-Zionism is defined as inherently anti-Semitic. Now, you tell that to Hannah Arendt and Avi Shlaim, Neve Gordon, Ilan Pappé, many prominent self-declared anti-Zionist Jewish academics and intellectuals, past and present. And then there's my personal friend, the Holberg Laureate from last year, Achille Mbembe, who was targeted by allegations of anti-Semitism in Germany in 2020. And I'll provide some very brief background on that. He was invited in 2020 to the Ruhr Triennale, an arts festival in Bochum in Germany, as a keynote speaker. Now, the arts festival's director came under fire from the National Commissioner Against Anti-Semitism in Berlin, Felix Klein, who decided on the basis of 2 short published articles and introductions to a book volume, 2015 and 2016, that Mbembe had relativized the Holocaust and that he was supportive of the BDS, the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement, which, by virtue of a resolution in the German Bundestag in 2019, in and of itself is anti-Semitic. Now, I can assure you that under any reasonable definition of anti-Semitism, the fact that Mbembe had referred to Israeli treatment of Palestinians as the biggest moral scandal of our time does not entail a relativization of the Holocaust. And that the fact that he had signed up for a boycott of Eyal University on a settlement, basically a settlement university on the occupied Israeli Palestinian West Bank, did not entail a wholesale endorsement of the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement on his part. Now, Achille has never been back to Germany after this and has become very careful about what he says about Israel and Palestine as a result of this. Then there's Ghassan Hage, fired from a post as visiting professor of anthropology at the Max-Planck Society in Halle, Germany, in early 2024 for a series of Facebook posts that were highlighted in a sort of hit and run attack by mainstream and conservative German newspapers. Hage has filed, so there's going to be, he lost the first case in a labor court in Halle, but has decided to take it to a higher court. And then there's the cancellation of a visiting professorship for Nancy Fraser, famous US critical social theorist, whose offer of a sort of prestigious chair at the University of Cologne in 2024 was rescinded on the basis that she'd signed an academic petition calling for a ceasefire. And there's numerous other incidents. I mean, the last thing I could think of in the German context would be the cancellation of 2 university events with Francesca Albanese and Eyal Weizman at the LMU in Munich and the Freie University of Berlin in March this year. Professor Michael Rothberg of UCLA has also informed me by means of a vast Excel file that he sent me, was generously, that there's been, ever since October 7, 2023, some 200 cancellations or postponements of events based on this throughout Germany. There's Hage and Felix Klein. So just to make this perfectly clear at the outset, I don't subscribe to any idea that these are quote unquote evil people with evil designs, right? Some of them obviously came to this with legitimate concerns, legitimate interest in combating antisemitism, right? And I think here I can quote the famous remark by Hubert Dreyfus on Foucault. He said in a passage, which I think is good, about human action in general. It goes something like this: people frequently think they know what they do. But what they don't know is what they're doing does, right? Okay, so to the crux of the argument, the IHRA working definition 2016. And this might, seem like something of a conspiracy theory itself, right? So just to make it clear, I don't subscribe to any conspiracy theories, but these are real actors and these are real events in the real world, right? So the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism was developed by 5 pro-Israeli Jewish academics working under the auspices of the American Jewish Committee, AJC, in 2004 to 2005. It was previously known as the European Monitoring Center Against Racism and Xenophobia, the IOMC definition, but it was in fact never formally adopted by the EUMC, the EU, or any EU organ. Now, the initial suggestion of such a definition came from Professor Dina Porat, who's the chief historian at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem and a professor of anti-Semitism studies at Tel Aviv University. Now, the initial funding for Porat's institute at Tel Aviv University was provided by Mossad, the Israeli Foreign Intelligence Services, and I'm not making this up. This comes from a very good book by a distinguished scholar of anti-Semitism with 40 years on his back in the field, Anthony Lerman, which was published in 2022. The work was coordinated by Professor Kenneth Stern of the American Jewish Committee. Other central drafters included Porat, the US rabbi Andrew Baker, and the UK's Michael Wine. So these have, in subsequent years, not only been the drafters, they have also been very active lobbyists for this definition. The context for the initiative was, of course, the Second Intifada from 2000 to 2005, the Israeli and US withdrawal from the 2001 Durban Conference on racism and xenophobia, where there was a walkout. Let me see. And the emergence of the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement in 2005. Lerman also argues that we must see it in the context of the war on terror, which of course started with Al-Qaeda's terrorist attacks on the US in 2001 and lasted until 2008. Pro-Israeli proponents of the 2005 EUMC working definition contended that it was adopted by the EUMC or even the EU. This claim even appears in a Canadian state handbook on IHRA working definition from 2021, but is factually incorrect. As a matter of fact, by 2013, the definition was removed from the website of the EU's Fundamental Rights Agency, which was the successor body to the EUMC. It was then proposed as a definition to be taken up by IHRA, by a long-standing US delegate to IHRA and chair of the IHRA's Committee on Antisemitism and Holocaust Denial from 2014, Mark Weizman of the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles. So we need to say a few words about what IHRA is in the first place. This was an organization established in 2000 after a 1998 initiative from the then Social Democratic Prime Minister of Sweden, Göran Persson. The acronym stands for the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which currently has 35 member states, including Norway, a member since 2003, and 8 states with so-called observer status. Also represented in IHRA are 8 permanent international partners, including the UN, UNESCO, OSCE, the Fundamental Rights Agency, the EU, and the Council of Europe. What goes on in this body? Delegates meet twice a year in the country which holds the chairmanship. Delegates, and this is quite curious because it's a very hybrid body. I mean, IHRA is made up of representatives of lobby organizations, in this case Jewish lobby organizations, delegates drawn from the bureaucracy, state bureaucracies in the countries in question, but also anti-Semitism researchers, bona fide anti-Semitism researchers. So if we take Norway's IHRA delegation, it is headed by a senior official at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a senior official from the Ministry of Education, but also includes scholars from the Holocaust Center in Oslo and the Falstad Center in Trondheim, or in Trøndelag rather. So adoptions. As of April 30, 43 states are listed by the IHRA as countries that have adopted or endorsed the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism 2016. This includes 26 out of 27 EU countries: the USA, the UK, Canada, Switzerland, Israel, Australia, Argentina, Colombia, Uruguay, the Philippines, and South Korea. The last country, and somewhat surprisingly to the Irish themselves, because part of the problem here is that a lot of these adoptions and endorsements happen without any public debate, let alone parliamentary debates. Right, so Irish people from a country which is officially declared by the present Israeli government, much as Norway, as an anti-Semitic government, adopted IHRA in March this year. The definition is furthermore recommended by the EU Commission, the European Council, the Organization of American States, OSCE, and the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion. No African country has adopted it. The Israeli Combat Antisemitism movement, based at Tel Aviv University, claims that 46 states had adopted or endorsed it, including Brazil and, remarkably, Bahrain, but this remains unclear. As a matter of fact, this caused me some headache yesterday when I discovered it. But I've double-checked, and it does seem that the basis for the allegation with regard to Bahrain is that Bahrain signed a memorandum of understanding with the US back in 2020, in which they, in principle, committed themselves to adopting the IHRA at a later stage, but they've never formally adopted it. And Bahrain, of course, broke off diplomatic relations with Israel in November 2023. As far as Brazil is concerned, it would appear that one makes an awful lot here of the fact that the cities of Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo have adopted it at municipal level, right? So we're not talking about a formal state adoption here. Some 350 educational institutions have adopted it. The last ones to do so were, of course, Harvard and Northwestern University in the USA. Some key points about the working definition. It was lobbied for over a period of 5 years by delegates from Israel and the USA in particular. And so this is, substantial, hard and committed work on the part of those lobbying for it, right? And I can tell you that people that I've spoken to who were at the relevant conference in 2016 have described this as a very unpleasant experience. Proponents of the definitions have, according to academic researchers Jamie Stein Warner, deliberately misrepresented the working definition by claiming that delegates to the plenary meeting comes last at these IHRA conferences. It is where the decisions are made, and these decisions have to be adopted by consensus among the member states. So the claim on the part of the proponents is that not only was the core definition of anti-Semitism adopted, but also the 11 examples, which is where it gets really, really problematic. This claim even appears in the EU Commission's 2021 Handbook for the Practical Use of the IHRA Working Definition of Anti-Semitism, very glossy brochure kind of thing. It lists the same Mark Weizman who lobbied for the definition for 5 years as one of the main contributors. But we have these written diplomatic records from Denmark, Sweden, and we also have information from Norwegian IHRA delegates in 2016 who all confirmed that the definition was only adopted after the 11 examples were made separate from the definition itself. Interestingly enough, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland have since all adopted it. Norway hasn't. I'll tell you a little bit about the background to that later. Here's Mark Weizman, really the engineer when it comes to the lobbying, right? So he convinced the Romanian chair of IHRA, the forthcoming IHRA conference in 2016, already during the IHRA conference in London in 2014, that part of the chair's commitment, because as a chair of IHRA, you want to make a show out of what you actually achieve, right, as a host country. So he convinced the incoming Romanian chair that Romania should commit itself to adopting this definition by 2016, or to make sure that IHRA would adopt the definition. Okay, a few words about what is so problematic with the definition. According to the main drafter of the definition, Professor Kenneth Stern, who since got very annoyed by the application, it was never meant to be used for legal purposes or form the basis for campus speech codes. In actual practice, though the definition itself is non-legally binding, it has long since been turned into what one of the most astute observers of this, Rebecca Ruth Gould, at SOAS in London, has described as soft law or quasi-law. In other words, law that doesn't present itself as law, but in actual practice is applied as law. But a main reason for its very success may be this very ambiguity and the lack of clarity. The very term working definition, what do you think of when people say working definition? Okay, we think that this is something that isn't settled, something we'll come back to later, right? Some other body, some other committee will make the final verdict on this. And the ample uses of qualifiers such as maybe leaves the question of what anti-Semitism is or is not to individual imagination. There's a linguist by the name of Susan Blackwell who's written extensively about this, where she sort of uses critical discourse analysis on the definition and its examples, and rather convincingly makes this argument. The core definition itself is not unproblematic, but I'm going to skip this for this occasion. But it is the 11 examples which are the most problematic. 7 out of 11 examples relate to Israel. What does that tell you? The main concern here is about what speech qualifies as anti-Semitic in the context of speech on and about Israel. It very obviously does not satisfy the requirements of a scientific definition, right? Because, I've worked with definitions of racism and Islamophobia. God forbid that anyone should ever want to turn those definitions into law. But working with definitions as most of us do from time to time, you realize that, a perfect definition doesn't exist, but you want it to be as clear and concise as possible, which this isn't. The proponents, nevertheless, see this open mixing of political interests and motivations and academic expertise as beneficial, right? It's something they're very proud of. Most notably Dina Porat and Mark Weizman. And here's another thing. The working definition has been very welcome on the far right in Israel, Europe, and the USA. It is anchored in the discourse about new anti-Semitism, which for all practical purposes turns anti-Semitism into a left-wing problem and allows for the sanitizing of the far-right record of historical anti-Semitism through the far-right's public performance of support for Israel. And by way of an obvious historical analogy here, Norway has had 2 right-wing extremist terrorist attacks. The first one on July 22nd, 2011. The perpetrator of that particular attack was very enthusiastic about Israel, which he saw as an outpost of white Christian Jewish civilization against the barbarian Muslim hordes, right? Now, if you look at the way he writes in the cut and paste tract about actually existing Jews in Europe, that's a completely different matter, which is, it so happens to be a sort of general pattern that we can observe if we look closely enough on the far right. Okay. And this I'm going to skip the core definition of the IHRA working definition. Just let me note that this isn't unproblematic either, right? For a very good critique of the core definition, I would refer you to the work of the German professor of anti-Semitism at the Technical University of Berlin, Uffe Jensen, who has published on this. So I have to say something about the examples, and here I've singled out examples 7 and 8 of contemporary anti-Semitism of the IHRA working definition 2016. And please note here that these are separate, right? So these are given as examples of what may be anti-Semitism. But they're not part of the core definition, even though its proponents would like us to think so. So there's 7, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, in other words, by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. And there's 8, applying double standards by requiring of it Israel not behavior not expected or demanded by any other democratic nation. Now, we may want to ask the question whether Israel is an ethno-state or a democratic nation, of course. I mean, that should be part of any inquiry into that matter. But the important thing here is what these examples are used to. How are they interpreted in actual practice? A few of these problems. So example 7 conflates self-determination with statehood, right? It basically says that self-determination for Jewish people is to be manifested in the state of Israel. There is no other way. It has nothing to say about the very denial of statehood of Palestinians that has been fundamental to the state of Israel since its founding in 1948 and the Nakba. Example 7 also openly invites labeling of analogies with racist state formations, in other words, apartheid in South Africa, as anti-Semitic. This is a label Israel has increasingly used to characterize the positions of Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, Adala, and so forth. The 2018 Israeli Basic Law obviously also enshrines Israel as an ethno-state, a state in which non-Jewish citizens have secondary rights to citizenship. That's regardless of historical Jewish relations to the state of Israel, which are obvious. You know, there's no denying that there is an emotional affinity and a political affinity between many Jews around the world and the state of Israel. But this is in fact the very definition of racism elsewhere in the world, that you don't treat your citizens equally under the law. And it is also undeniably a fact that the current state of Israel has far-right and racist politicians in power. Now, I give you the charming characters of the Kahana Chai and convicted of racist hate crime in Israel, former cabinet minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, who was recently feted at Mar-a-Lago and at Yale University. And there's Bezalel Smotrich, both with a long and sustained record of genocidal and racist hate speech against Palestinians. And this is a far-right that increasingly allies itself with far-right and anti-Semitic political formations in Europe and the US. So that raises the question, when does Israel actually qualify as a racist endeavor? The problems with example 8, double standards. This is a formulation drawn from the Israeli politician Nathan Sharansky's so-called 3D test of anti-Semitism. So denial of self-determination and so forth. What does it say? 5 minutes? Okay, right. In actual practice, this formulation encourages Israel to declare criticism of its sustained 77-year-long record of violations of international laws and human rights to be reflective of double standards, as indeed it does, right? Israel has also declared any reference to the term genocide in the context of its war on Gaza as anti-Semitic, even if Israeli-born academic experts on genocide, and these are some of the most distinguished experts on genocide in the world, have been among the most vocal about the applicability of precisely this terminology. I'm thinking of Professor Amos Goldberg, Professor Omar Batov, and Professor Ras Segal, the last one of which is now actually looking for a job in Europe because of the fact that he has referred to what is going on as a genocide. which was completely unacceptable to a group of corporate donors at the University of Minnesota, where he had been offered a chair as a director of a new center on genocide studies and Holocaust studies. Okay, so I mentioned that Stern, the main drafter of the precursor to the IHRA working definition, has made it clear that it was never intended to be a campus hate speech code or to form the basis of an attack on academic freedom or free speech. So that's important, coming from where it does. There's also Professor David Feldman, a leading scholar of anti-Semitism at Birkbeck College in London. The definition is imprecise and isolates anti-Semitism from other forms of bigotry. Forcing its adoption will not help protect Jewish students and staff. Now I'm going to run a bit fast. There's also a public letter from 122 Palestinian and Arab intellectuals, Abdallah et al., published in The Guardian. The definition conflates Judaism with Zionism in assuming that all Jews are Zionists. There's also a 2022 letter to the General Assembly of the UN signed by 128 scholars of anti-Semitism and or Holocaust studies, as reported by Al Jazeera. The definition here, according to these scholars, one of which is a distinguished Norwegian anti-Semitism scholar, is vague and incoherent, has been hijacked to shield the Israeli government. This came in response to the then Israeli UN ambassador trying to force it through the UN, with the support of the Anti-Defamation League in the US. Then there's a 2023 letter to the UN Secretary General signed by 104 human and civil rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch, the American Civil Liberties Union, B'Tselem and Adala, which basically warns about adverse consequences for human rights and freedom of speech, and for anyone seeking to speak and organize in support of Palestinian rights. We have also had alternatives launched, like the 2022 Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism and the 2021 Nexus document, that are critical responses to the IHRA working definition and take exception to the conflation of critiques of Israel and anti-Semitism inherent to it. I think it's important to raise this question, which I think Anthony Lerman raises more eloquently than I do. What is the point? What is the effect of this, right? Because these alternative definitions, they operate on the same terrain as the IHRA definition. There's an assumption that as long as we improve our definitions, this is a battle to be won by legal and rational argument. But it hasn't succeeded as a strategy because it doesn't have the backing of state actors. It doesn't have the backing of lobby organizations to the same extent that IHRA has had. So this is trying to pretend that you're Habermas when you're dealing with something quite else than rational argumentation in the public sphere. Yeah, this I need to skip. The case of Norway, because I make no secret of the fact that part of what worries me in all of this is the consequences for academic freedom, but also for freedom of assembly and freedom of speech. Now, as I indicated, Norway is one of very few European countries left that haven't adopted or endorsed the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism. And this basically means that we are not bound legally or morally by the IHRA working definition, 2016. It doesn't mean that Norwegian governments do not do a good job at combating anti-Semitism. It's just that we haven't chosen this particular instrument in order to do so. The Norwegian state action plans against anti-Semitism actually reference the working definition, but they do not suggest that the definition or the examples therein have a legal status. And among serious anti-Semitism researchers in Norway, there is limited support for the working definition. There's also reason to believe that senior officials at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs are not too excited by it either. I've been looking for proponents of the definition in Norway. You find a few of them among Christian Zionists, some of whom have actually managed to convince themselves that we have in fact adopted and endorsed this, which is factually incorrect. There's also some representatives from Jewish bodies in Norway that have advocated for it, but in more subtle ways, not very public. And we also know that a previous Israeli ambassador to Norway, Israel now has withdrawn its diplomatic representation in Norway in protest against the Norwegian government's recognition of a Palestinian state last year. But we know that Israeli ambassadors have been actively working to propose it to Norwegian officials, which is entirely within their diplomatic rights, of course, right? You represent the state that you're employed by in this context. I didn't get to say much about the implications for Middle East researchers, but a Brismas report concludes that IHRA represents a threat to academic freedom and freedom of speech. This analysed 53 cases in the UK after British universities' forced adoption of the definition in 2020 and found that only 2 cases had led to disciplinary action. I mean, cases in which tenured faculty were actually fired because of anti-Semitic speech. Most notable was a professor of sociology at the University of Bristol, David Miller. This report also finds that black and minority scholars and scholars in untenured positions are most adversely affected. In the US, a Middle East Scholar Barometer survey by Lynch and Telhami from 2023 found that 82% of US-based respondents, including 98% of assistant professors, said that they self-centered when speaking professionally about Israel and Palestine. And 81% said they primarily held back on criticism of Israel, 11% on criticism of Palestinians. So that's the Palestine exception to academic freedom and freedom of speech, of which Palestinian academics have been speaking for a number of years. And I think, with respect to the organizers and you in the audience, I think I should leave it there, and so that we also get a chance to talk a little bit about this. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for an extremely informative and in-depth presentation. You explained a little bit about the effects for some scholars, and we've seen after the Trump administration entered, there's been deportations of students in the US. But could you also speak a little bit about how the adoption of this definition has affected students?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, academics are after all in a relatively privileged position, especially if we're tenured, right? It takes a lot of work to get us fired, right? Students at various levels do not have the same privileges, right? So what we've seen, obviously, in the US is these really scary arrests and detentions of particularly Muslim and Palestinian students at US universities who've done nothing apart from engaging in what is perfectly legal and legitimate speech under the US First Amendment, right? And I'm thinking here of the case of Mahmoud Khalil, who was arrested on Columbia University campus on March 8 by ICE agent and sent to Louisiana, where he's still being held in a detention facility, and missed the birth of his first child. I'm thinking also of this Turkish scholar, Uzturk, who had done nothing apart from signing an op-ed in a student newspaper. Now, the way in which they do this is, of course, by legal figment, if you like, right? So they found a 1952 McCarran-Warren Act, which entails or provides the Secretary of State the prerogative to declare citizens that, or not citizens, but persons present in the US or trying to get to the US to be in contravention with US foreign policy interests, right? And this was McCarthy-era legislation. It was actively used during the McCarthy era to put a stop to immigration to the US of Holocaust survivors from Eastern Europe, most notably Poland, who were suspected of having communist sympathies, right? So the grandparents of a certain Jared Kushner was among these, right? They found a legal loophole. They were Polish but pretended to be German and avoided targeting by this act. So in terms of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly for students and people that are not as safe as us, I think this is absolutely chilling and disastrous.
Thank you. Do you also have an overview of how this has affected students over the past decades, where the definition has been been operating? But it culminated sort of after Trump, but how has it affected students also prior to Trump? And also maybe in Germany.
Yeah, I haven't looked much into this, but I do think that if we think of the climate generated by all of this, right, the greatest danger here, most people affected will not be arrested or deported, right? What it does is create the kind of chill that there was during the McCarthy era, where people self-center to an enormous extent, right? So there is, as of today, 2 new reports issued by Harvard University, which had interviewed students and faculty, 2,300 students and faculty of Muslim, Christian and Jewish background. The figures are quite striking, right? Because I think something like 92% of respondents of Muslim background say that they are afraid to speak their mind on campus, right? 92%. The comparative level for Jews, 61%. Students and staff reporting that they don't feel safe on Harvard University campus, 15% for Jews, 47% for Muslims, right? So this is completely topsy-turvy. And by the way, I mean, Harvard, a lot of the problems here also relate to the fact that university administrations have become so scared that they, in the terms of the great historian Timothy Snyder, obey in advance, right? This is Snyder from On Tyranny, 2017, right? So the interim president of Columbia University, Catherine Armstrong, did not say a word about the, frankly, illegal arrest of a former student on campus. I also found that, the dean of the school at which Mahmoud Khalil studied, has a background as an intelligence officer in the Israeli army, right? Now, I honestly wouldn't, in that kind of climate, and this is what I'm hearing from faculty at Columbia, that there is this terrible fear.
Thank you, Sindre, very much for the lecture. Very interesting and partly shocking as well. And I think partly shocking as to how Norway has contributed in this organization. I think there should be probably more discussion about what is really the role of Norway in this respect, although Norway has not adopted this definition. I'm a professor of international law and have worked on human rights, but I have not worked in particular on this IHRA definition. But could you elaborate a little bit on how the research community doing research and having discussions on this topic, how they relate to human rights in general? Because I think that's an important aspect of it. Why do we need any such definition at all? I mean, we have universal rights. Jews are protected by universal human rights and international law on equal footing as any other group, and we cannot have definitions, particular definitions for each particular group. Why should we have that? That's very contrary to the whole idea of human rights, universal human rights, that we have the same rights and they are equally applied to all groups and peoples. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Einarsson, for raising a really interesting question. I wholeheartedly agree, as a matter of fact. There is an argument to be had here about where all of this is coming from. Rebecca Ruth Gould, I think it's in her monograph Erasing Palestine, argues that a lot of the thinking here comes out of certain varieties of differentialist thinking that we've also seen in academia, right? I don't completely subscribe to the idea that, identity politics and critical race theory have all that much to do with this, right? But you could certainly make that argument, right? That the various expressions of identity politics creates a terrain in which particularistic forms of thinking thrive. And these are forms of thinking that might not be all that conducive to the idea of a shared world with universal rights. One of the more disturbing things I've seen in response to the IHRA working definition comes from Muslims in Britain, right, where Muslim bodies, having seen this enormous success that this has had, are now busy lobbying Parliament for a similar official definition applied to Muslims, right? And there we go, right? If we continue down that path, heaven knows where we'll end up, but we'll certainly not end up in a world in which there's any chance of finding points of convergence around universal human rights.
Hello, thank you for an interesting and detailed presentation. I'm originally from Germany, so it's been very interesting, at least to say, following German debates, reading German news and then Norway, and yeah, just seeing very different realities. So I was wondering, because we've been talking about, or we've seen the consequences it has on the US, right, when it comes to both arrests, deportations, people getting fired, this general fear spreading. In Germany, we see the cancellations of events. We also know repercussions for people that, yes, have not gotten positions and so on. So what I'm wondering is, based on what you see, when it comes to the German context, do you think that this is just going to follow the US path? Is it going to be more and more extreme? Also when it comes to knowledge production, I mean, especially, of course, Holocaust studies, remembrance culture, and so on. Those are topics which are humongous in the German context, and they have huge effects on knowledge production at schools and universities. So where does that path lead us? Like, what are the potential consequences there? And then when it comes to working relationships in the academic sphere between, well, the US, Norway, and Germany, Norway also, how does that affect these relationships when there's these very different parallel realities in which, as far as what I've seen, academic spheres operate? Yes.
Thank you very much. I do think that you're more qualified to answer your own question than I could possibly be, right? Germany obviously has its own peculiarities, right? So I don't necessarily think that there will be the same trajectory as we've seen in the US with regard to this. I mean, in Germany, the AfD is still not kosher, right? So much so that at this recent Combating Antisemitism conference organized by the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs in Jerusalem, in Israel, the AfD was not invited among these many delegates from European far-right parties. But I do worry about the same kind of hollowing out of fundamental human rights and liberal and democratic freedoms in Germany as elsewhere. I mean, Germany has, for obvious historical reasons, been one of the most eager to implement this, and I do think it has had serious consequences. I'm hearing from German academics that the detailed micromanagement of avoiding accusations of anti-Semitism has now reached the level of you can't put up a poster at a university saying Palestine or some such thing. On a more principled level, what does this tell us? I mean, part of my concern here is that we're seeing globally a new transnational far-right and racist alliance. And this is not only a threat to academic freedom and freedom of speech, it is ultimately a threat to liberal democracy as we've come to know it, right? Since 1945. And so Germany is partly a test case for this, right? Given the huge successes the AfD are now having, also in sanitizing its own record of anti-Semitism.
We have time for one more question, and then we will have to end. But we can continue the conversation outside this room. But yeah, one more question.
It's pretty short, I think. So I just want to also say that considering that there is so much self-censoring everywhere, right? It's also important to remember that it's not only about censoring or freedom of speech, but the consequences of it, because that allows atrocities, right, when we don't speak up against it because we're scared. And so I just want to ask, is there any coordinated counter-lobbying at all?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think the levels of coordination here has been all that great. I mean, the Jerusalem Declaration on anti-Semitism was a counter-mobilization, right? But for the reasons I alluded to, it hasn't been very successful. I've only come across 2 universities in the entire world that have adopted the Jerusalem Declaration. That happens to be the University of Cape Town in South Africa and the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. Right, so that's the amount of success that has had. But I do think on a more principled level that, as Pelle indicated, I do think that the question of Palestine is a litmus test about where we're going. In a much more fundamental sense than a lot of people are realizing, right? I was recently in Qatar, just by way of example, at a conference organized by the Qatar Foundation on Orientalism, and one of the speakers in my panel was a US academic based in California, UCLA, very distinguished professor. He got a question from the audience, from an architect, Qatari architect, who wanted to know about his stance on Gaza. And the professor's reaction was, I cannot speak because I have a family in the US and I want to get home after this conference, right? And so the architect came up to us afterwards and said, you have to realize that this is really the critical test for the entire West. And so what I'm hoping with my own intervention, small as it is, small as it may be, is that it may contribute to raising this debate in wider public spheres, but also among academics. Because I think there's been a tendency among, I'm not an anti-Semitism researcher, right? So I'm an intruder in this field. No one in this field, and I know quite a few anti-Semitism researchers in Norway, have told me to back off yet. But that may of course come, right? Allegations of anti-Semitism may of course also come. But I think this is, in terms of liberal democracy's future, these are questions too important to be left to corridor talk among anti-Semitism researchers, which it has been also in Norway to date. Right?
I'm sorry we'll have to end now, but please join me in thanking Professor Wangstad, and thank you all for coming to the event today.